Greetings and welcome. My name is Travis Zada, and I'm a professor of religious studies here and a scholar of Islamic intellectual and social history. I am truly thrilled to present Lorraine Daston to you. Before proceeding with this brief introduction, I would like to remind you, as we have done at the beginning of the first two lectures, that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent, interfering with the speaker's ability to speak, and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy. Now, with that out of the way, let me thank Debbie Cohen and the Terry Lectureship Committee for inviting me to introduce this, the third and final installment of Professor Daston's lectures on natural disaster. At the beginning of the week, Debbie gave us an eloquent account of the encyclopedic range of Daston's work and her prodigious productivity. As the last two lectures have demonstrated, Daston deftly navigates intellectual boundaries and historical periods. As she follows the interconnections between science and religion, philosophy and theology, not only through the world of ideas, but also through close attention to material culture, changing sensibilities, and the variegated hues of lived human experience. Again and again, we are called to both reflect on the mutual reinforcement of theory and practice, and to think about and think with the synthesization of a broad swath of human endeavor. This is something that I have truly admired and found inspiring. For my part, I was first introduced to her work while taking a medieval Latin paleography course with her co-author, Catherine Park. This was at the beginning of my graduate studies in comparative literature, merely 2 years after the publication in 1998 of their authored book, Wonders in the Order of Nature. On Wednesday, we heard from John Peters how, among the many interventions made, this groundbreaking study reconceptualized the early modern phenomenon of the Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, not only as a microcosm of the universe, but also as an important chapter within the history of science. But in addition to wonder and its corollaries of curiosity, perplexity, and bemusement, Daston unveils a landscape haunted by monsters. For me, these themes have played an outsized role in my own intellectual development over the course of the years. Much of the terrain that Daston has covered in her career finds parallels outside of the Latin West. Monsters, for instance, abound in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu writings on natural philosophy with a deep history stretching back through antiquity. Though there is much that is shared, our vocabulary for monstrosity born in the Latin West is by no means isomorphic with Islamic discourses on nature. But much of this, importantly, has to do with metaphysics, a theme that we've been hearing throughout the course of these lectures. Following a long line of emanationist thought, Muslim scientists and theologians were historically quite loath to invest the physical world with any form of pre-existing evil. Being, as Plotinus and Avicenna knew, was itself pure good. This view finds expression in the pithy and influential Arabic phrase, "Laysa fil imkan abda mimma kan," or there is, in all possibility, nothing more wondrous than what is. The result of such optimism, in the strict philosophical meaning of the word, is to strip evil away from both monstrosity and disaster, at least in its ontological sense. But as it may, be that as it may, it is a position that Orientalists and missionaries during the Enlightenment and through the course of high colonialism frequently ridiculed as a cruel form of fatalism. What resulted, though, in this philosophical complex was a theodicy which accounted for pain and suffering through a set of sensibilities governed ultimately by a radical form of monism. As strange as all this might be, such differing views on being, knowing, and feeling highlight the necessity of approaching the history of science and religion not only as interconnected, but also contingent formations. This is a point that Daston has repeated throughout her work. She invites us to look with fresh eyes at what might seem quotidian, unremarkable, or banal. In doing so, she stresses the strange and curious formations of modern Western epistemology, not as a framework for universal theoretization, but rather as contingent and historically situated phenomena. Boredom, she reminds us, is simply unnecessary. Indeed, what could be more strange and curious than the actuary computations of insurance companies which underwrite global capitalism? And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Daston. Thank you.
Since this is my third and last lecture, threefold thanks are in order. First, to Travis for that generous introduction. It is exceedingly pleasing to imagine the likes of Plotinus and Avicenna in some kind of cosmic seance with insurance underwriters. Second, my thanks to the archivists at Swiss Reinsurance, upon which I will be drawing in this lectures. Those of you who are historians know how difficult it is to gain access to corporate archives, and I'm really grateful to the generosity of Swiss Reinsurance for allowing me to do the research that made this lecture possible. And third, and finally, and most emphatically, thank you, my audience, for your fidelity in coming to these lectures when I know a bonny day beckons outside on a Friday afternoon. I will leave Yale enriched by more and better ideas than I came with. Thank you. The interactions have been invigorating. So let me begin. Oops, let's see if this works. So in the contract that Yale University asked me to sign preparatory to giving these lectures, there was a standard force majeure clause. Neither party shall be liable to the other for any delay or default in performing hereunder, in such delay or default is caused by conditions beyond such parties' reasonable control, including but not limited to acts of God, wars, strikes, and severe weather conditions. Nothing was said about protests. As we saw in my last lecture, an act of God can be either narrowly or broadly defined. So, for example, the International Chamber of Commerce, which has every interest in being let out of contractual obligations, includes not only earthquakes, volcanic activity, and hurricanes, but also pirates, sabotage, and civil war. But in contrast, case law referring to acts of God in the 19th and 20th centuries was overwhelmingly about natural disasters, some of which were as devastating as we saw in my last lecture as the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, and others as mundane as an overflowing wading pool after a heavy rain. However force majeure is defined, the clause is a tacit confession, not just of limited liability, but also of human humility. We are neither omniscient nor omnipotent. We can neither predict nor prevent all eventualities. All we can do is admit that the best laid plans of mice and men do often go astray. The force majeure clause is where contract law and insurance meet. Not only contracts, but also insurance policies include force majeure clauses to anticipate that which cannot be anticipated. Improbable, but not impossible, worst-case scenarios in which all bets are off. Situations in which all human foresight and prudent precautions are unavailing. These are the situations that mark the limits of human knowledge and human power. Contracts and insurance policies are by definition about an unknowable future, and they tacitly assume that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow will be roughly like today. The force majeure clause whispers that this assumption is hubris, and that the future is irreducibly uncertain. When the world is suddenly turned upside down by a pandemic that locks down whole countries, or a volcanic dust cloud that grounds all planes, or wildfires that spread like wildfires. Notions like liability, blame, and responsibility lose their traction. And so do the actuarial statistics and the mathematical models that are based on them. So just as the lawyers and the judges wrangle over whether and when human negligence may have worsened, for example, earthquake damage by lax building codes, insurance companies puzzle over whether earthquakes are the kind of risks that ought to be insured at all. In both cases, what's being argued over is whether, in this case, earthquakes fall under the force majeure clause, or whether humans might be able, in fact, to exercise a degree of reasonable control in such situations, and if so, just how much. No one goes so far as to claim that earthquakes can be prevented or even predicted by human agency. But in the law courts and also in the insurance boardrooms, just where to draw the line between human agency and force majeure is being earnestly debated. What no one questions is that the line between human agency and force majeure is shifting before our eyes. The question of where just to draw that line, especially in an age of global climate change, has become urgent. Widespread scientific consensus about both the fact of climate change and its largely anthropogenic causes has moved the line to expand the realm of human agency and shrink that of force majeure or acts of God. Because since the 18th century, the prototypical legal example of an act of God has been the natural disaster. This means that natural and disaster are becoming decoupled, especially in the case of disasters that can be plausibly traced back in whole or in part to climate change, such as hurricanes, wildfires, floods, mudslides. Many commentators speak of unnatural disasters, and they reject the legal label of act of God. Even disasters unrelated to climate change, such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, have been increasingly scrutinized for elements of human malfeasance that may have made a tragic situation worse. So we're fast losing the Enlightenment category of the purely natural disaster, and with it the idea of blameless evil. So once again, as in the Enlightenment, we're in one of those metaphysical moments in which the boundaries between the natural and the human and between blame and bad luck are in a state of flux. In this lecture, instead of tracking these metaphysical movements in philosophical treatises or poetry or novels, I'm going to focus on the concrete practices of the law courts and the insurance companies. I'm interested in how these practices are redefining in real time what disasters are and who's responsible for them. My premise is that in these rolled sleeves, with their, these are practices with their shirt sleeves rolled up, that in these practices we can catch glimpses of a new metaphysics and also, I think, a new ethics in the becoming. What we do and how we do it is reshaping how we think about nature and responsibility concerning disasters. So I'm going to begin with recent reinterpretations of that force majeure clause, as I said, known in Anglo-American law also by the archaic sounding but oft invoked legal notion of the act of God, still very much in use in contracts, even contracts as banal as mine with Yale University, but also in the fine print of insurance policies. And I choose these examples because it makes vivid and concrete the sea change in recent attitudes toward natural disasters. The courts are really where the rubber hits the road when it comes to assigning blame and even legal liability for such events. So this is the new ethics of unnatural disasters in action. At least in the law courts, human responsibility for what were previously seen as natural disasters is expanding to the point at which no disaster, including earthquakes and volcanoes, can be said to be absolutely clean of human fingerprints. But the insurance companies, especially the reinsurance giants like Munich and Swiss Reinsurance, are tugging in the opposite direction. That's my second example of how disasters and risks are being radically rethought. In an astonishing reversal of their traditionally risk-averse, statistics-heavy attitude toward insuring natural disasters, they have, in recent years, actively sought out these risks by selling catastrophe bonds, which are essentially a high-stakes bet on two notoriously unpredictable phenomena. First, major disasters, and second, the stock market. In contrast to the law courts, which are investigating the chains of causation and therefore putative responsibility for damages caused by hurricanes, earthquakes, and melting glaciers in minute forensic detail, the assurance companies have amalgamated all of these risks, from bad building practices in earthquake zones to the ups and downs of the Dow Jones, into a kind of catastrophe casino. The one point where the practices of the law courts and the insurance companies converge is in the obliteration of the category of the purely natural disaster. And in my conclusion, I'll return to the consequences of losing this distinctively Enlightenment creation. So, the law courts. Let's return for just a moment to that boilerplate passage in my contract with Yale. Note the passage which is highlighted in green. Beyond such parties' reasonable control. The word reasonable does an immense amount of heavy lifting in this passage. All cases of act of God exemptions, both past and present, revolve around two fundamental questions. Was the natural disaster that caused the damages foreseeable by a reasonable exercise of prudence? And if it was, were all reasonable precautions taken to minimize the damage? That word reasonable is deliberately elastic. It allows the judge or the jury to assess whether foresight and precautions in a particular case were not only possible but sensible. Could these criteria have been met without Herculean efforts? Judging what is reasonable in a particular case means figuring out what distinguishes prudence from heroism, common knowledge from prescience, risk from uncertainty. What is currently being argued in courts in many countries is just how far that elastic word reasonable can be stretched before it snaps. Let me take what is perhaps an extreme example, but an extremely interesting one. This is Lake Palcachoca in northwestern Peru. It's a glacial lake in the Andes, and in 2015, a Peruvian farmer named Sol Luciano Lulia lodged a civil suit in a regional court in Essen, Germany, for damages against the oldest German energy company, REW, which was founded in 1898 in Essen as the Reines Westfälisches Elektrizitätswerk. So Lulia, who is being supported by a German NGO called German Watch, argued that this lake above his valley was being filled at an alarming rate by a melting glacier above it due to the elevated temperatures caused by climate change. once the lake filled, it would have overflow, and when it overflowed, it would fill the valley below, deluging not only Julia's farm, but that of all of his neighbors, and ruining their livelihoods. With the help of Germanwatch, that NGO, Julia calculated that REW, which has been in existence, as I said, since 1898, has contributed 0.47% of the carbon emissions that are responsible for climate change and therefore the impending disaster of the overflowing glacial lake. Julia did contemplate bringing a case before larger energy concerns like, for example, Shell or Exxon or British Petroleum in US or UK courts, but these similar environmental cases have been dismissed so far in US courts and UK courts. But the German courts were willing to take on this case. And at the moment, the case is being adjudicated by the highest court, highest regional court. I suspect it will make its way all the way to the German Constitutional Court. In May 2022, as soon as pandemic conditions allowed, German judges and experts visited the lake. A decision is expected sometime this year, probably in a matter of months. So the amount of damages that Julia is seeking for the imminent flood is really pocket change for REW. It's $18,000. So they could easily settle this out of court. And his suit remains the only one of its kind in the world. But jurists and environmentalists alike, including in the US, not to mention big energy firms like Shell and British Petroleum, are monitoring the case closely because it could set a precedent for holding big polluters accountable not only for local damages in the present, but for worldwide damages stemming from actions from the remote past, regardless of whether the late 19th century founders of REW could have possibly foreseen such consequences. So here, in this case, reasonable foresight and reasonable precautions may become retrospective, more a matter of reconstructing chains of causation than of the state of knowledge and the web of intentions. Now, as I said, I think this case represents an extreme. I think there's a reason why only the German courts are willing to take it on. But it's by no means unique. As of 2022, there were at least 2,000 legal cases relating to claims for damages relating to climate change in process in the courts of about 40 countries. And 3/4 of them are here in the United States. In the majority of these cases, the defendant is not a private firm like REW, but actually the state, with the plaintiff's intention being to force the state either to comply with international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord, or to protect human rights, or to fulfill its constitutional duties to protect its citizens' security. The overall success rate of such civil cases to date has been about 54%, which I am told by those more expert than I is a fairly high percentage for cases of this type. Now, since the lion's share of these climate change-related cases have been filed in the US, the outcomes of recent American court decisions and legal scholarship involving acts of God, force majeure defenses, are directly relevant to how legal thinking about natural disasters and questions of blame, responsibility, and liability is evolving. So take the case of a suit filed by property owners in New Orleans against the US Army Corps of Engineers for failure to take reasonable precautions against flooding from hurricanes like Katrina. You'll remember Katrina was in 2005, but it's by far, it's not by any means the last devastating hurricane to strike the Gulf of Mexico and the very vulnerable southern coast of Louisiana. And so the Army Corps of Engineers is charged with negligence for not maintaining the levees that protect this part of New Orleans and the rest of the coast, Louisiana coast, to a sufficient degree that they can withstand hurricanes of Category 4 or 5 force. The Army Corps of Engineers gave a classical act of God defense. They said, look, these are once in 100-year, maybe even once in 1,000-year storms. Our levees are not designed to protect against such rare act of God occurrences. Therefore, although we completely agree that the loss of life and property is tragic, we do not think that we bear any responsibility here. It's unreasonable to have expected us to have built to that degree of protection. The judge in the case disagreed. It was a Federal Circuit Court judge. He chastised the Corps, I must say somewhat repetitiously, for, quote, insouciance, myopia, and short-sightedness. He granted damages of $700,000. This decision was reversed, but it was reversed on a technicality. Apparently, you can only sue a federal agency to a certain amount. But the judge's opinion was not gainsaid. As one headline summarized the ruling, I'm not sure what happened to that slide. I hope it will turn up at some point. It was Hurricane Katrina. It was not an act of God. What you see here, I think, will be very familiar to those of you living in the New York area. This is Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York and New Jersey in 2012. And here we see, a very similar kind of reasoning taking place. In this case, it's not about reasonable foresight. So that was what was at stake in the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers case, which was, should the Army Engineers have been prepared for storms of the force of Katrina or Ida? In this case, nobody has any doubt but that by the time Sandy was being tracked by NOAA, everyone knew it was going to hit the Northeast coast. So the question is not about reasonable foresight, it's about reasonable precautions. And there are two cases which are very interesting because they're in many ways extremely similar except for the way in which the decision went. So courts released the New York container terminal on Staten Island from liability for damages caused by Hurricane Sandy on the grounds that the management and employees had worked around the clock to try and shift their warehouse goods to higher ground. They didn't entirely succeed. The storm surge was so high that some of the goods were indeed waterlogged, but they were exonerated. They had taken what were deemed to be reasonable precautions. But another court case made a warehouse in New Jersey pay up for flood damages due to the same hurricane. Again, it was water damage, because the management had failed to take any action to avert losses except to move the boss's Porsche to higher ground. So there's no disagreement in either case about either the magnitude of Hurricane Sandy or the accuracy of the weather forecasting. The act of God defense was upheld in one case, but dismissed in the other purely on grounds of what constitute, in this particular case, reasonable precautions to take in such a situation. But the same rethinking that has blurred the line between natural and man-made disasters among activists and scientists has also begun to take root in the law, a sign of how broadly and deeply new attitudes toward blame and responsibility have become established. So legal scholars have long been quite uncomfortable with this archaic phrase, it dates from 1581, of the act of God, either on theological or philosophical grounds. The theological argument, either everything is due to an act of God, or the philosophical argument, nothing is due to an act of God. But nonetheless, it's still invoked in such cases. But the new critiques take a strikingly different tack. So in the midst of planetary crises, such as climate change and the recent SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, The question now being posed, isn't even the most horrendous scenario actually foreseeable? And aren't even the most expensive and extreme precautions now obligatory? What can reasonable foresight and reasonable precautions mean in this exceptional situation? And isn't everyone, most especially those with economic and political power, now responsible to protect the world from disasters that are unprecedented in their magnitude, but which no longer meet the criteria that define force majeure? So there's been a plethora of articles appearing in legal journals attacking these questions. I'll just give you a sampling of two of them. In one from 2016 relating to climate change, it's entitled Acts of God or Acts of Man, Rethinking Contractual Impracticability in Times of Climate Change. The author asserts it's becoming increasingly implausible to argue that events that were previously unforeseeable acts of God or nature remain so, given today's readily available scientific knowledge of the cause of extreme weather events, and concludes the difference between man and nature is becoming a distinction without a difference. So now, liability, both civil and criminal, is potentially unlimited. In an article on the COVID-19 pandemic, the traditional definition of a force majeure event as a hurricane or some other natural disaster that's no person's fault is seen as a very awkward fit for the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. First, the scientists had been predicting something like this pandemic for years. And second, many governments, starting with China, had been plausibly accused of underreach, that is, of failing to prevent the crisis or prevent its spread. So in the case of both climate change and pandemics, what now constituted reasonable foresight and reasonable precautions in a court of law has been raised to the nth power. So let me summarize this section. The legal category of the natural disaster that's nobody's fault, the act of God, and that could neither be reasonably anticipated nor resisted by reasonable measures is vanishing. Science has vastly expanded the domain of what can be reasonably foreseen and extended chains of causation to implicate human complicity even in disasters, as in the case of the Peruvian farmer, that could not be foreseen. And this applies not only to cases that are related to climate change or to the pandemic, but also to earthquakes. For example, the shoddy building construction that can multiply casualties tenfold, or the chronically underfunded health system that collapses in an epidemic. So pervasive has this new way of thinking become that even events which it really lies beyond the ken of scientists to predict, for example, earthquakes, can call down blame and even criminal indictments, as when 6 Italian seismologists were convicted in 2012 of manslaughter for not adequately warning the public of the risks of an earthquake that killed 309 people in 2009. This sentence was ultimately reversed by a higher court, but not before some of the seismologists did jail time, which sent, so to speak, shockwaves through the seismological community. So the earthquake, which was once the paradigmatic example of terrible suffering that was nobody's fault, now even an earthquake triggers a search for someone to blame. So we're now turning to the insurance companies. Every 50 years or so, there is a natural disaster that inflicts such cataclysmic damage in a wealthy, fully insured part of the world that even the world's biggest insurance companies face enormous claims that threaten their very existence. And as I described in my second lecture, that's what happened in 1906 after the San Francisco earthquake, when a score of insurance companies went bankrupt and quite a few others teetered on the edge of ruin. It's also what happened in 1965 when Hurricane Betsy laid waste to southern Florida, the Bahamas, and the Louisiana coast. It became the first Atlantic storm to cause over $1 billion in damages, as well as taking 81 lives. It's at these moments that badly shaken insurance executives question the fundamentals of their business. What exactly is an insurable risk? How much risk is too much? Even for these masters of disasters, the world's leading reinsurance companies. Now, most of us are never going to deal directly with reinsurance companies, so let me explain what they are. So we deal with primary insurers. When we buy auto insurance or health insurance or home insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance, these are the primary insurers. But then the primary insurers want to hedge their bets, and they in turn buy coverage from these reinsurance companies, these great big reinsurance companies. And the reinsurance companies, if it's a big risk, in turn hedge their bets by trying to buy coverage from other firms in what is called retrocession. This looks very complicated on paper, but in fact it's really simple. It's the principle of not putting your eggs in one basket. So the idea is that you want to spread the risk in as many baskets as possible. So this means that the reinsurance companies, especially the big ones like Swiss Reinsurance and Munich Reinsurance, which are the two largest ones in the world, imagine a situation in which all the claims from a hurricane like Betsy or an earthquake like the 1906 San Francisco one or the 1923 Japan one funnel up to Munich and Zurich. So they are literally where the buck stops. They're the people who are really monitoring. They're sort of disaster central. They know what is happening. So it's not surprising that they knew before anybody else did that something strange was happening to the weather. Already in the 1970s, they watch the number of claims for damages from windstorms of all kinds, flooding. Again, remember, this is only in rich parts of the world that buy insurance. They note that they're on a steady rise, not the kind of statistical fluctuations you would expect if these were truly random events, randomly spaced events. By 1985, Swiss Re in Zurich, the headquarters of Swiss Re in Zurich, had established a commission of the world's leading reinsurers set up to study weather and earthquake risks. And they began to fear that climate change-related weather patterns might soon prove more disastrous for the insurance industry than earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Swiss Re in the 1970s tried to sound the alarm. They actually hired a journalist to try and publish articles on what they saw as an impending danger. Unfortunately, they were voices crying in the wilderness. When disasters like Hurricane Betsy and then Hurricane Andrew, which some of you will remember, began to strike, and the costs of these windstorms went up steeply, the Swiss Re insurers held what you might call a kind of philosophical seminar. If you look at the minutes of their board meetings, which are normally, the kind of dull minutes of board meetings that you imagine, it's about their profit, their loss, the Christmas party, it's the usual. They suddenly turn existential, and they begin to ask, can we really bear these kinds of risks? Should we instead allow the state to step in? This is, of course, a heresy for the insurance industry, because usually there's nothing they fear more than state intervention in their business. But at such moments of what for them are existential crisis, they begin to worry, what's the difference between a risk and uncertainty? So risk is something that you can quantify with a probabilistic model versus uncertainty, which is a situation in which we have no idea. All bets are off. And there was really good reason, I have to say, for them to be wary about insuring these kinds of natural catastrophes. First of all, they don't have the kind of statistical distribution that, say, fires do or floods do, which is, you can't predict them individually, but you can predict them pretty well over a 5-year period or a 10-year period. A major catastrophe might hit in 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, even 10,000 years. Even in rock-solid Switzerland, earthquakes could not be ruled out. I was astonished in looking at the minutes of the Swiss Re meetings in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, how often the Swiss Re executives brought up the Basel earthquake of 1356 to remind themselves that no place, no one is ever safe. Moreover, the losses wrought by such a catastrophe were cumulative. So with life insurance, usually your life insurance company can depend on the fact that when you die is independent of when your neighbor dies. But if a hurricane or an earthquake or a wildfire sweeps through your neighborhood, suddenly these are no longer independent probabilities. So you start to have, and of course also cumulative property damages. And then you have multiple branches of the insurance industry being involved. Remember that in the San Francisco earthquake, there was the earthquake damage, but also compounded by the fire that immediately broke out because of the ruptured gas mains. Calculating the possible losses was almost as tricky as estimating the probability of the occurrence of a disaster, and that deprives the actuaries of their two most important data points when they're trying to calculate reasonable premiums. And finally, it was almost impossible to build up sufficient reserves for the once-in-a-century catastrophe, if only because taxes and inflation would inevitably nibble away at the investment. So Swiss Re has been in existence for well over 100 years. And one thought they had was, well, what we'll do, since we plan really for the long term, at least a century ahead of time, is we'll just start putting aside money. They're already surely amongst the world's biggest investors because they have all our pension funds. We're all involved in this. And then they realize, looking at the inflation figures over 100 years, how much they would lose. And they never succeed, even in convincing the very lenient Swiss government that this should not be taxable income. So that kind of nest egg against future disaster also was not a possibility. So there was great pressure for them just to withdraw from this entire area of insurance. But they eventually give in because of market and government pressure. So the market is Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London, if they're willing to insure earthquakes, then Swiss Re and Munich Re feel they too must have a foothold in the earthquake business. And if the governor of Florida threatened to exclude Swiss Re from all insurance dealings in his state if residents living in floodplains were refused hurricane insurance, how could Swiss Re withdraw from one of the most lucrative markets for life insurance, home insurance, fire insurance, etc.? So you have these discussions in the Swiss Re boardroom seesawing back and forth between the position that insurance of catastrophic risk was absolutely impossible and the retort that any risk was insurable as long as the premium was high enough. And in any case, necessary if Swiss Re is going to maintain its leadership status in the worldwide market. So despite all of the warnings of the doomsayers, here you see the risk zones, by the way, of Florida, and you see why Swiss Re wants to get out of this market. But here you see how their worldwide network has expanded. The dark green are their direct insurance commitments, and the light green are the ones which their partners have insured. All of these claims eventually will come back to headquarters in Zurich. So unsurprisingly, this vast liability made the Swiss Re executives the most nervous of nervous Nellies. The minutes of their meetings of the Board of Executives in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s read like the transcript of a group therapy session for advanced anxiety syndrome. In the 1950s, they shudder over mounting claims for car accidents and opine it would be better if everyone went back to bicycles. In the 1960s, they fret over the increased technological rationalization of factories like this one, which makes factories not only more expensive to build, but also more expensive to rebuild in case they burn down. In the 1970s, they curse the new jets being introduced by Boeing as diabolical engines because increased air traffic in expensive planes means more accidents and higher claims. The Swiss Re executives never tire of preaching that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. They worried that the mere fact of taking out an insurance policy might lull homeowners and their governments into complacency when it came to taking prudent precautions. And their minds are always racing to the worst case scenario. So in the Cold War, as it heats up in the 1950s and the 1960s, they begin to worry about what will happen if another world war breaks out. They have still very fresh in memory, of course, World War II. Switzerland was neutral, but it was between Italy and Germany, two warring countries. So they think, well, maybe we should relocate to the United States. And then they realize that the next war is likely to be a nuclear war, and the US is likely to be a target. And then they think, well, how about Canada? And they say, no, it's too close to the United States, and it's on the flight path of those Soviet missiles. When the war in the Middle East breaks out, they decide that they would like to, the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, they consider exiting the otherwise extremely profitable Israeli life insurance market, too risky. After one of their executives visits South Africa, they cancel all riot insurance after they've seen Soweto. Headlines about riots in Los Angeles, floods in Hamburg, wars in the Middle East trigger fits of jitters in the boardroom of placid Zurich as the Swiss Re executives waited for the insurance claims that would ultimately and inevitably end up on their desks. So until the late 1980s, the very idea of expanding insurance against natural disasters made Swiss Re executives reach for their smelling salts. The company had been dragged kicking and screaming into covering flood damage due to hurricanes in states like Florida for fear that they'd be shut out of the rest of the insurance market by local governments. And when the claims from Hurricane Betsy decimated the company's reserves in 1965-66, some Swiss Re executives thought it might be high time to start preparing the public psychologically for the fact that insurance cannot cover all risks. There had always been, especially in the Swiss reinsurance company, a view that the only way for a company to survive was to draw a bright line between insurance, which was founded on sound actuarial statistics, and gambling. So this has been a leitmotif of the insurance industry since the 18th century, which is to, on the one hand, say that the insurance which is being offered, even though it involves uncertainty and risk, is based upon sound actuarial statistics, whereas putting your money in the stock market or going to the casino is a form of gambling. And it's been highly moralized. I mean, I think some of you may have seen advertised. This is one, a vintage one, but the idea is it's part of being a provident, far-sighted, responsible head of household to buy insurance, life insurance for the breadwinner of the family, house insurance. This is part of a bourgeois way of life in which you foresee possible risks to your family, and you take precautions which are based in solid mathematical calculations in order to avert them. So that's very much the ethos of a company like Swiss Re. And something very puzzling happens starting in the 1990s. And I should say at this point, I was no longer allowed to actually look in the archives. So I've got to piece together what happened from the sources that I have. So starting in the 1990s, the famously risk-averse Swiss Re executives begin actively courting risks for which there are no reliable statistics, as they were the first to admit. They start putting out a series of glossy brochures like this one or this one, which feature some rather frightening damage caused by a natural disaster, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, even earthquakes. Notice storm over Europe. The purpose of this brochure is to persuade the Europeans that they are not immune from the kind of ferocious weather that North Americans have to endure. These are the kinds of events that force majeure, act of God clauses, these exclusionary clauses, were meant to protect the insurance companies for, and now they're actively trying to promote a market for this kind of insurers. So the message that's broadcast by these brochures is one of fear. These risks are terrifyingly real. They're growing with every year. And it's also a message of hope. Insurance coverage was available to avert the total collapse of cities or even whole countries should disaster strike. And you can see the way in which they start to really increase, starting around the year 2000, their insured peril losses. Especially the primary perils, that's the dark blue here in the bar graph. Now, nothing had happened to change the situation with regard to either reliable statistics about frequency and intensity or the estimate of maximum possible damages. What does seem to have happened is that the Swiss Re executives, and here they're quite explicit, had gotten involved in another kind of risk insurance, which served for them as a kind of mental template of how you might be able to start insuring these natural disasters, these catastrophic natural disasters, which they had previously shied away from, and that was nuclear reactor insurance. So starting in the 1950s and the 1960s, following the lead of the United States, they start offering insurance for nuclear reactors as part of a pool. The US created a pool of US insurers, and Swiss Re was the organizing force for doing the same in Europe. And what happened here was, this is if there is something like Chernobyl, the potential risks are almost as devastating or more devastating because they will last for longer than a massive earthquake. The pool offers insurance up to a certain level, and then the state takes over. And the state had an interest in doing this because the state wanted, especially certain states like France in Europe, had an interest in promoting nuclear reactor energy. So that serves for them, for the executives, very explicitly as a model for how you could start to think about insuring catastrophic natural disasters. The second factor that contributes to the erasing of distinctions between the human and the natural, which is, of course, what happens with the nuclear reactor insurance, as well as between statistically quantified risks and out-and-out bets, is the financialization of everything that starts in the 1990s. So within the complex mathematical models of major insurance and reinsurance companies, the risks of a hurricane of Katrina proportions or the fiscal collapse of Lehman Brothers These are risks which are fungible in these mathematical models. They're all grist for the simulations mill. And by establishing what's called a cat peril team to model all such catastrophes, Swiss Re seemed to be perfectly in step with these developments. So you have a situation, if you look at the organogram of Swiss Re in the 70s and 80s, you see that they have a technical department which consists of the actuaries who are doing the calculations, but also of a lot of mechanical engineers. And these mechanical engineers are people who travel to, say, an oil refinery in Libya, and they crawl under the pipes and look for rust, they kick things to make sure they're in good order, and then report back to headquarters as to whether or not this is a good insurable risk. They start to be replaced by young people with MBAs and degrees in data science who never leave their offices in Zurich. And these younger data scientists instead start to create models which are as much about the vicissitudes of the stock market, the world stock market, as they are about damages caused by world catastrophes. And they develop something called a catastrophe bond. So a catastrophe bond is familiar to historians of ancient insurance, because it's a kind of all or nothing bet. So here's what happens. You have to be a fat cat investor in order to play this game. I think the minimum investment is something like $1 million. But as I say, we're all in this. If you have a pension fund, you are in this, because there's no other place to invest that money. So what you can do is just go to an insurer like Swiss Re and say you want a kind of medley of risks. A little Japanese earthquake, a little bit of California wildfire. You can decide on the percentages. And for a certain well-defined parameters and a well-defined period, if nothing happens during that period, then you not only get your investment, you get an interest rate which is well above what the stock market will pay. But if something does happen in that period, that's it. You've lost everything. So this is an astonishing reversal of the nervous Nellies of Zurich, who are now acting like riverboat gamblers. And what you see here is that all these parameters are estimated but not predicted and brought into quantitative alignment with each other by the assumptions of a mathematical model which makes absolutely no distinction between the risks of the stock market and the risks of nature. So let me conclude. In practice, if not theory, the category of the purely natural disaster is evaporating. And it's evaporating both in the law courts and in the insurance companies. But at least at first glance, the same ends are being achieved by diametrically opposed means. So in the case of the law courts, we have a minute examination of chains of causation that might reach back more than a century into the past. And they are looking to find humans to blame, even if, as in the case of the Peruvian glacial lake, there is absolutely no possibility of foresight in the case at hand. And this is even the case not only in climate change-related disasters, but also in those paradigmatic cases of a natural disaster, namely earthquakes, as in the recent earthquake in Turkey and Syria, where the search for culprits began almost as soon, or indeed before, rescue operations. So these are chains of causation and responsibility that are being extended ever further into the future and the past. In this case, the law court case, the imagination here is the causation is determinist, and therefore the responsibility is determinate, right down, as in the Peruvian case, to the fourth decimal point. The particulars of culpability are specific to the case at hand. So it's this wildfire that destroyed this town on this date due to the greed of this developer or the negligence of this electricity firm. Okay, so that's on one side. On the other side, you have the insurance firms like Swiss Re selling catastrophe bonds that lump together the most disparate disasters, regardless of their causes or geography, into a kind of ontological and moral soup. So what matters is not what kind of disaster or who's to blame, only who will pay up. So instead of a close scrutiny of causes in the individual case, catastrophe bonds posit overall randomness in the aggregate. Now, you could certainly exaggerate this contrast. No court has yet entirely denied the agency of nature in hurricanes and earthquakes, and no reinsurer would recommend ignoring precautions that could reduce damages should the worst come to pass. But the overall trends are quite clear. Divergent lines of practice that nonetheless converge in the same conclusion. It no longer makes sense to talk about the distinctive category of the natural disaster, terrible but blameless. Those of you who heard my first lecture may be wondering whether we've just come full circle and we're back to the medieval tribulations. I don't think so. I think that, first of all, the medieval approach to these kinds of disasters, both caused by humans and by God and nature, was a kind of mania for explanation, citing both natural, human, and divine causes. But there's also the causal diagnosis serves at least a psychological effect, because it was believed that once you knew what the causes were, you could also avoid future cataclysms. So if people would stop carousing on Sunday, or if the king would give up his illegitimate wife, the earth would stop shaking, the floodwaters would recede. In contrast, there's absolutely no attempt in the modern dispensation toward that kind of causal analysis leading to remediation. Nor, I think, does very awkward talk about human-natural hybrids capture the genuine novelty of whatever new metaphysics is emerging from the practices that I've described. And I think that whenever you get talks about hybrid, what we're really talking about is a situation that underscores the breakdown of the old metaphysics. So we're reduced to soldering mismatched parts into chimeras like this one. So lion's head, goat's body, serpent's tail. I mean, well, all this is not a therapy. This is a diagnosis. So the old ethics seems to be collapsing along with the old metaphysics. Blame, responsibility, and liability, of course, are distinct concepts. They're, just to remind us a bit, so in a criminal negligence case, someone can be legally liable for damages without having directly caused or intended the damage done. So if someone slips on your unshoveled snowy sidewalk, even if the injuries are greater than they would have been by a case of assault with a deadly weapon, the punishment is likely to be a fine rather than a jail sentence, which measures the distance between liability and blame. And also in the case of responsibility, it doesn't necessarily apply blame or liability. So a ship's captain or a government official or a university president may take responsibility for a mishap that occurs under their watch without having been personally involved, indeed, having taken strong measures to try to avert just such an occurrence. The responsibility comes with the office, and it's a matter of professional honor to shoulder the consequences. So in contrast to those two cases of liability and responsibility, blame is always fraught with moral condemnation. One sign that the Enlightenment category of the purely natural disaster for which no one was to blame is disappearing is the fact that blame has returned with a vengeance. In this finger-pointing age, there's more than enough blame to go around, all of it fiercely moralized, from the fossil fuel companies making fortunes by burning up the planet to those of us, scholars and scientists, jetting to conferences. I think of my flight to Chicago tomorrow. Not to mention all those things we have been ordering online, all those packages, all those delivery trucks. Everyone has a share in the blame for climate change, but blaming everyone effectively reduces to blaming no one. So even if the shape of the metaphysics and the ethics to come is still indistinct, I think we can nonetheless discern some faint outlines. Despite their opposed approaches to dealing with disasters of whatever kind, the law courts and the insurance companies share an emphasis on consequences. So once disaster has struck, what's going to be done with it? In both cases, redress has been literally cashed out, whether in the form of monetary damages awarded or insurance claims paid. Because someone has to foot the bill, there's always someone to blame. In the case of the law courts, blame is now being hypothetically stretched to cover not just developers who flaunt building codes, but also the governments that let them get away with it. And in the case of the insurance company, blame lands on victims who are too feckless to buy insurance, but also on the governments that don't compel them to do so. Viewed through the narrow lens of the law courts and the insurance company, a geographically dispersed disaster in slow motion is no disaster. They're always dealing with specific cases until it erupts into spectacular devastation right here and right now. Once again, it falls by default to the state or to some international consortium of states to encompass the risks that span centuries and continents. So the state is really the shadowy but ubiquitous presence in all of these disaster scenarios, regardless of whether they're attributed to nature, to humans, or to both. It's the state that's expected to foresee, plan for, and mitigate disasters into the ever more remote future. It is the state that is expected to care for the victims and repair the damages when recourse to law and insurance lies out of reach. After all, a lawsuit requires expensive legal expertise, and insurance policies for hurricanes and earthquake-prone regions can be brought only at a prohibitively high price. And you can see an example of this with the Federal Emergency Management Association of the United States. So this is FEMA, as it's known, offers flood insurance to Americans who can't afford the premiums for flood insurance because they've built their homes in floodplains. And FEMA is going bankrupt because these subsidized rates come nowhere near to covering the costs of rebuilding the same homes. And when FEMA tried, after Hurricane Sandy, to try and send a signal of moral hazard to the homeowners saying, you might want to reconsider building your house on higher ground, there were massive protests, and even the most Tea Party-ish of the Republicans clamored to have the unrealistic premiums restored. So once again, the state is the insurer of last resort. When residents of Caribbean nations chronically ravaged by hurricanes found insurance out of their reach, their governments banded together to form a self-insurance pool whose first priority in the case of a major disaster would be to prevent state collapse, not to rescue the victims, to prevent state collapse. And just a few weeks ago, the European Court of Human Rights found the government of Switzerland guilty of endangering the lives of its citizens by failing to meet its commitments to lower CO2 emissions. So even mammoth reinsurers like Swiss Re, which insouciantly issue catastrophe bonds and manage astronomical sums, make it clear that they depend on the state to cover losses in a nuclear reactor accident or an earthquake that lays waste to a densely populated and wealthy area. So states have long justified their powers by their responsibility to offer their citizens security. So at first, this was security, military security from enemies on the battlefield. Increasingly in the 20th century, it was security from sickness, want, and poverty in the form of social security. And each time state responsibilities have expanded, so have state powers. This has reassured some and it's alarmed others. In the 21st century, state responsibilities seem to be once again expanding, this time to provide security from disasters without regard to who or what caused them. So a new category of blame is coalescing: state failure. Failure to foresee, failure to forestall, failure to protect, failure to rescue, failure to repair. We only have an inkling of the expanded powers that will be required to meet these new responsibilities. Certainly, it will involve a rethinking of the foreshortened timescales of democratic election cycles and the circumscribed geographic scale of the nation state. So in my first lecture, I began with a vision of the disaster that suddenly erupted in the midst of the everyday as the historical event, the rare happenings that crystallize memory and rupture the continuity of past, present, and future. Natural disasters punctuate history like exclamation points. But in the current metaphysical moment, disasters are becoming more like commas, all too frequent breaks in the course of events, the next one coming hard on the heels of the last, a sequence with no end in sight. Just as the elongated timescale of the mega disaster that is climate change is forcing us to reimagine disasters as processes unfolding over the course of generations, so the global scale of the measures that will be needed to combat this slow-motion disaster is forcing us to envision radically new kinds of governance. Even if the category of the natural disaster is fading, the vast scale of nature is now a gauntlet thrown down to the political imagination. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Daston, for that climactic conclusion to what has been a week of immense intellectual stimulation. I'm sure we have many questions for you. We'll have time for a few. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. In the back.
A bit louder, please.
Thank you for the talk. So in your portion about the insurance companies, you mentioned the improvements in predictive algorithms and how that essentially allowed for a redefinition of force majeure. I was wondering if you had any opinions on how the definition of force majeure could change with this technological improvement in predictive algorithms on the court side as well.
Right. I mean, my impression is that it's going to disappear. It's like Marx talked about the state. It's going to wither away. I think that when you have a situation in which there is an increasing expectation that the state will be the safety net of last resort, that the idea that private parties will need protection to be released from contractual obligations will come to seem increasingly archaic. But that is my guess. And there are legal minds in the audience, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say about this. I look forward to a day when Yale University Press sends me a contract without the force majeure clause. So.
It's a nice invitation to questions from legal scholars in the audience. Or a question from anyone.
I'm not a legal scholar.
I'm relieved.
I'm wondering in your research if you've come upon the problem of how models for GDP tend to take natural disasters as a positive, where the insurance payouts actually indicate GDP growth. Like this happened after the recent wildfires in California, for instance. And I'm just curious, sort of when the state becomes the insurer of last resort, but at the same time, maybe a different branch of the government is, seeing projections that indicate, on the whole, that a disaster in this sort of narrowly defined metric is a positive. I'm wondering, whether
What an interesting question about the metaphysics of accounting. I hadn't realized that the insurance payouts counted as part of GDP, and it reminds me of how in the 18th century, in the absurdly optimistic mode of the natural theologians, it was thought that the biblical deluge, although very unfortunate for all the people and the animals that drowned, was good because it increased industry and boosted the economy. A similar kind of logic seems to be going on. I think it will be really interesting to see. There are polities, for example, the Scandinavian countries, where over 50% of the GDP is already state expenditures. And we may end up seeing that being the harbinger of the future for other states as well, that the public sector is going to expand enormously at the expense of the private sector. The real question is, at what point will companies like these gigantic reinsurance companies like Munich and Swiss Re give up their resistance to state intervention in the insurance industry? And as I say, unfortunately, I had no access to their deliberations after 1990, but I'm sure they're thinking about this. In the early 1960s, when the United States Congress decided that it would spread a safety net underneath companies like General Electric that were building nuclear reactors, because if they weren't insured, nobody would buy them. They decided that they were going to take the average between zero claims and infinity. And if you divide 0 plus infinity by 2 and you're the US Congress, that's $500 billion. So I think there will be some fancy footwork with the accounting going on in this case. So.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. During the last lecture, you talked about how the Enlightenment concept of natural disaster involved a changing concept of God and his power in the world. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this change we're going through right now, where the concept of natural disasters is disappearing, if it means that our concept of nature is changing in a similar way.
So what's very interesting, you might imagine that our concept of nature is becoming one of increasing savage might, given the damages wrought. But in fact, if you look at the popular depictions and the vocabulary in which nature is described, it's increasingly of our endangered ward. So we have a very interesting divergence of the reality of increasingly savage damage wrought by natural disasters, but with an increasingly fragilized view of nature and of our responsibility for nature. So I think you've put your finger on a really interesting contradiction in our imaginary, in which we have allegorized nature as both an unprecedentedly savage force and also an unprecedentedly fragile one.
I'm sorry, I have plenty of questions to ask you, and I'm sure I'll get to them. This is a bit more specific, I think, to the Swiss Re archives, perhaps, which is really I'm really curious about the coinciding of machinations of the oil industry, the opening of oil fields, for instance, like the Alaskan Arctic, et cetera, with insurance company deliberations, even pre-1990. I'm actually very curious what they were talking about in the 70s, for instance, with the OPEC oil crisis. How are they assessing what insurance should look like in cases where energy and energy companies were perhaps most of the center of, thought. But was it always the nation state that where the buck stopped, or were energy companies actually involved in the thinking here?
No, you're absolutely right. The Swiss reinsurance had an attitude toward the finances of the rest of the world, which was like unto Swiss banks, which was their official description of this would have been scrupulous neutrality. Another less charitable way of phrasing this was that they were indiscriminate as long as there was money to be made. So their interest was very much in whether or not, regardless of potential environmental damage or the kind of government, for example, in Libya, which was in power, or the machinations of the world OPEC, the OPEC cartel, their interest was entirely about insurable risks. And they saw that as their narrow mandate and did not see themselves as called upon to make any judgments whatsoever about the geopolitical situation, except as it might have impacted, for example, via war, their insured risks. So the one aspect, and this is related to why it's very difficult now to do research in the archives, the one aspect where they do become increasingly active is about climate change. And that's because they recognized by the 1970s that if this goes on, if the weather continues to worsen in this way, it's going to be very expensive for them. And they decide in 2018, along with Allianz and Munich Re and a few other gigantic insurance companies, not to insure any more coal mines. Now, you cannot operate a coal mine without insurance. And the attorney generals of Republican states with coal mines took this very ill and are suing them for antitrust. So because of this pending legal case, you can understand why they do not want anyone poking about in their archives in the more modern period. So they have since, in recent times, in fact, gotten involved in the politics of climate change. This was, in many ways, a UN, at least supported initiative, I think launched by Allianz. And it was too effective. That is, because it would have really had an impact on coal mining, retribution was swift and terrible.
This is a gripping conversation. I don't want to cut it short, but we have the opportunity to continue it over a reception next door. I want to ask you to bring all your belongings with you because this room will then be locked. But please join me in thanking Professor Daston for his stunning set of very lectures.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.